Insomnia Cafe doesn't sound like the name of one of the most successful TV shows of all time. And yet, this was almost the title for a little comedy about 6 New Yorkers navigating life, love and work. So in this episode, as we remember the late Matthew Perry, we discuss why it became so huge and what that tells us about America, as we ask, could Friends be any bigger? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining me today is Dr. Rachael McLennan, Senior Lecturer in American Literature and Culture and Head of School for Art, Media and American Studies at the University of East Anglia. Rachael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Liam. I'm really pleased to be here and have a chance to talk about this show, which is one of my favourites.
Yes, can't wait. And as one of the sort of the first people that I really spoke to about this whole podcast idea, like a year ago now, over a year ago, it's wonderful to finally have you on the show.
Oh, thanks. And for me, it's really great to support the podcast as well. So, and to get to do so while talking about a show that I love so much and do a bit of, responding to recent events is really fantastic too.
Yeah, of course. And, the nature of this whole episode has come about a little bit unexpected, I guess, due to the very sad and untimely passing of Matthew Perry. And as a millennial, as someone who grew up with Friends, celebrity deaths don't normally upset me, but this one really did. It was very sad.
Yeah. I know. I feel very much the same, actually. I'm probably a slightly older millennial. I'll call myself a millennial anyway. And yeah, it was just very, very sad to hear the news. And for about 2 days after, I was thinking about Matthew Perry a lot. Just I was going about my day and stuff. I was actually lucky enough to see him in London. He did a play a few years ago called The End of Longing. And I feel even more lucky now to have got the chance to see him on stage. He was just brilliant. It was very special. And I'm sorry he's gone. And I do feel like, I know I'm talking about the show in general with you, but it does feel like it's a nice little act of kind of memorialization as well, and getting to say thank you, Matthew Perry, for being fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chandler Bing has always been one of my cultural inspirations. I've always wanted to have the humor of Chandler Bing and the fashion sense of Jim Levinstein from American Pie. And 25 years later, that's still exactly the same. So yeah, and I guess like most people, Friends has just been embedded in our sort of cultural psyche. And so we want to talk about that. We want to celebrate that. And of course, look back on what a wonderful person and actor Matthew Perry was, as well as the whole of the Friends cast and everyone involved. Because at face value, Friends, as a concept, is nothing particularly sensational, is it? It's 6 people, largely just sat in a coffee shop talking and getting themselves into very bog standard sitcom situations. Why are we sat here now talking about it like nearly 30 years after it first aired?
I know. I think in a way you have nailed it, though. I think it's, the genius of the concept is in its simplicity, really, I suspect. Who can't identify with having a friendship group and that kind of desperation to find out who you are and make your way in the world in your slightly messy, slightly chaotic 20s, which again, I think is a fairly sort of generic life experience for everyone, whether you are watching the show, decades after it was aired the first time, or whether like me and maybe like you saw a bit of it first time around and then, get to watch it again nostalgically. So certainly for me, I get to watch it with that dual lens. Actually, I can remember what I was doing at certain times when I watched the episodes for the first time. I can remember how exciting it was when a season ended on a cliffhanger. And people would go about for months going, so whose bedroom does he go into? Is it Bonnie's or is it Rachel's? But now, of course, you can sit all day and just like binge, the entire
Yeah.
10 seasons in like a fortnight or something if you have the time and the energy, which I would do if I had the time and the energy. Yeah.
But I wonder if that was part of it though, because nowadays, you can go onto your favorite streaming service and
Mm-hmm.
you can just binge something in a day, and then
Yeah.
a month later, everyone's forgotten about it.
Mm-hmm.
Friends, like a lot of big shows at that time, it was like event television because you only had the TV schedule, and you had to put aside that specific half an hour of your week to
Yes.
watch the latest episode. And Friends it was just huge. And I remember the final episode being this like massive like landmark
Mm-hmm.
event that the world felt like it ground to a halt for that
Yeah.
hour. But I first started watching Friends. It was, you mentioned the whole sort of Bonnie or Rachel cliffhanger.
Mm-hmm.
That was the point that I started watching it, because I
Yeah.
remember I must have been about 11 years old, and it was FOMO. It was entirely FOMO. My friends were talking about it and like, oh, Friends is starting again. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a watch.
Yeah.
Um, and by the end of that season 4, I was hooked. And then that was it. I had to go back, rewatch all the old ones, and it was just, that was it. Then I was
It
mad
was.
about it.
I know. It's just lovely hearing everybody's different story about it. So for me, I can definitely remember an episode in season 1, like watching that the first time it came out. And it was the one where I think the bulk of the jokes are around Monica and her obsessive sort of tidiness. And it's a Chandler episode, actually. He's got a plot with he's seeing the very beautiful lady who has like a husband and 3 other boyfriends or something like that. And Chandler decides that he can't be part of this very, complicated menage. So that's the first episode I remember watching. But I was only a pretty early teenager. And then when it finished 10 years later, I was finishing up my PhD. So you go through 10 years of a season, of a series rather, is a long time for people. And even if you join in like season 4 or 5, it does become immediately part of your kind of life story, I think, and you start being able to sort of chart your own experiences. And as you say, there were less channels to watch, so people had less viewing options. But it was just such a brilliant show. People wanted to watch it anyway. And I think that it was almost like, if it's not too anachronistic, kind of like a water cooler moment. You would talk about what happened in the different episodes. You would talk about it with your friends, with your family. And I think that whole concept of friendship and sort of community is what the show is all about anyway. So it kind of taps into the viewing experience and kind of syncs that up very nicely with some of the big themes of the show itself.
Yeah, and I think talking about it in that way, there's definite parallels to other sitcoms like Frasier, which haven't maybe endured as much as Friends has, but ran kind of parallel to
Yes.
Friends. And I think Frasier was perhaps more designed for slightly older audiences, where
Yeah.
Friends really kind of tapped into sort of popular culture and sort of the zeitgeist of the time. But I think what both shows managed to do really well, Friends perhaps gets more credit for it,
Mm.
is understanding that kind of the nature of how it was being consumed, and really really tapping into the power of a good cliffhanger at the
Yeah.
at the end of a season. And Friends was brilliant at that, because
Mm-hmm.
for that 6 months that it was off air between
Mm-hmm.
seasons,
Yes.
people talked about it arguably more than they talked about it when it was on air, because
Yeah.
you wanted to know what happened.
Exactly. I know, and the whole debate about, is Rachel pregnant? That was another massive one. And then like, what's happened with Monica and Chandler? Just there was so much to talk about. And yeah, it was just absolutely, it was the equivalent of, I suppose, I don't know, reading a magazine like Heat or something like that and getting
Mm.
your little fix of, pop culture through that particular show. It was just such a source of pleasure. And I think it still is. And I think that explains maybe the difference between Frasier. Maybe there will be strong Frasier fans listening to this feeling very outraged at me right now. But like, Frasier was so smart and funny and clever, but I think Friends had a kind of levity
Mm.
as well, which again, I wouldn't want people to think that I'm saying Friends is superficial or slight, because it's not. It's such smart, sophisticated humour. But there was just something very pleasurable and light about Friends that I think maybe allowed everyone just to sort of get sucked in and enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Friends is a more easygoing watch, but I think it
Mm-hmm.
just it managed to just tap into this kind of I don't it's something universal. It spoke to people.
Yes.
It didn't need to be clever. It didn't need to be really particularly witty or over intelligent.
No.
It was just, I think Friends, more than other shows, perhaps before or since as well, just kind of expertly shone that sort of mirror, or held that mirror up to society and reflected back what people were seeing in their own lives. And I think that's what works so well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so, yeah, I talked earlier about how it taps into sort of issues in your 20s, which I think is true. But actually, they're just quite fundamental questions like, who am I? What am I going to do with my life? You know, and then underneath all of that, it's the bedrock of your friendship group, whatever that is. And that's what keeps you sane when your job is bad, or you have a bad breakup, or you're just having a boring day and you want to find something to entertain yourself with, you know. So there are times when Friends acts as if the viewer is part of the friendship group. And again, I think that is just so powerful about it as well. There's a lovely episode quite early on where Phoebe does a recap of what's happened so far. And then she sort of breaks the fourth wall, looks straight to camera, and she says, but anyway, enough about that. How you been? You know, and just bringing the audience in and making you part of the experience, I think is what people loved about it as well.
Yeah, and really feeling like you're part of that group and part of that conversation is, and that was, I think, quite different, you know, for the time. Like having that fourth wall there is standard, you know, multi-camera kind of comedy setup. But them kind of for large parts of episodes being sat round a few sofas in a coffee shop, it brings you in, doesn't it? It makes you feel like you're there.
Absolutely, yes. And even there are so many things like, when you think about it, 90s, like coffee culture was starting to be a thing. You know, we take that for granted now, but it wasn't really at the time the show came out. So the idea of just going to a cafe and sitting, hanging about for hours and drinking coffee, that wasn't that common, you know, but the show sort of really tapped into that. And it made sort of massive stars out of all of its actors right from the beginning. And I think that's been a source of pleasure for a lot of people viewing it as well. You know, you get to watch the actors change on screen. You sort of follow their off-screen lives as you're growing older as well. You know, there's just lots of things to be invested in.
Yeah, and actually, you know, looking back at Friends, I mean, like with any show that you rewatch countless times, on every rewatch you notice something extra or different that you didn't before. But you mentioned about Friends really sort of tapping into that sort of boom of the coffee culture. I guess not just in America but worldwide. But there's that episode, isn't there, where they is it a look back, or is it a kind of what if? I think it was a look back, and Central Perk was a bar, and it was like a pool bar, and they were joking about the fact that it was being closed down and turned into a coffee shop, and kind of ridiculing that, weren't they? So you know, in its own way, Friends really provides a good sort of point in time documentary for what life was like in America, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it does. And I was thinking again in sort of preparation for our chat, you know, there's no social media in Friends. You know, they don't sit around the sofa having their coffees and saying, "Oh, I've just uploaded this image to the gram," and you know, or someone was really awful to me on Twitter, and like, what do I do? I've got into trouble at work. You know, there's no social media element in Friends, but that doesn't date it weirdly for me as well. Yet in other ways, it is so absolutely of its time. You know, we've talked about coffee culture, for example. You can watch. I don't know. I quite enjoy watching the changing fashions and hairstyles and things like that as the decades go through as well. So yeah, I think you can probably tell it's just a source of endless pleasure, really.
Yeah, and I wonder, because we watched Friends at the time, so there's, I think, to us there's something quite nostalgic about Friends, and we grew up in that time. But Friends remains a huge show, to the point where I think reportedly each of the cast members was still, even up to now in 2023, earning like $20 million a year each in royalties. You know, it was $1 billion property per year for Warner Brothers, and it ended in 2004. What is it about Friends that clearly doesn't just speak to those who were fans at the time, but to whole new audiences who are rediscovering it?
I think so. Again, this is going to sound very historically specific, but I think it's a sort of illustrative example. So after 9/11, there was a boost in viewership of Friends at the time because people saw it as a comfort watch. And I can very much see that in the wake of such a sort of national or global tragedy. People wanted to watch something sort of a bit more friendly and reassuring. But I think that's why people watch it now as well. You know, even if you didn't grow up with it at the time, I still think the humour is so sharp. It's broadly optimistic and reassuring. Again, we could talk about maybe some of the gaps it has in its representation, but on the whole, it tells a optimistic, cheering story about the power of friendship. Everyone makes it into their 30s pretty unscathed. There are no serious traumas. You leave the show kind of waving goodbye to them, knowing that they're going to be all right in their adult lives. It ends, actually, I think Chandler has one of the last lines, and he makes a joke about they're leaving Monica and his apartment, and he says something like, "Shall we get a coffee? Where will we go?" Or something. And the joke is, of course, they will go to Central Park. So I think there's a lot to do with reassuring rituals of familiarity and bonding. Just don't get old. It doesn't matter when you watch them and what age you were when you first saw the show or didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if that is the difference between shows like Friends and shows more recently like The Big Bang Theory, both of which were hugely popular, huge successes. However, it doesn't feel like The Big Bang Theory has that staying power that Friends had. And I wonder if it's exactly as you said, because a show like The Big Bang Theory is maybe too much of its time and it's too situational. And maybe Friends doesn't get enough credit for actually having those layers and having those kind of universal themes running underneath it
Yeah.
that help it to be so enduring.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we're getting into thinking about what it tells us about American culture, but it tells us, I think, quite specific things about the desire for the American dream. Being filtered through the experience of coming of age, growing up into adulthood. But as I keep saying, I think these are really fundamental and I would say universal questions, despite the lack of diversity on the show that it often gets criticised for. Just these very basic questions: who am I? What am I going to do with my life? Who are the people who are going to support me while I do that, and who stay with me through thick and thin while everything is complicated, and then have the good times with me as well? It's just absolutely fundamental to human experience, and I think there's a strong wish fulfillment element to it as well, because I won't be too sort of naive about it. Not everyone has the kind of friendship group that you watch in Friends. Not everyone has the kind of economic privilege that they seem to have in that little Friends universe. And yet people get so much out of watching them debate for 30 minutes over, what they're going to do for Thanksgiving or something. So, yeah.
Let's look a bit at representation in Friends, because we're sat here as two white adults who grew up with Friends, and it's not surprising that we like it, because it was a show that was very white and represented very white problems and lifestyles. One of the things that Friends was criticized for, even at the time, was its lack of diversity in its casting. Is that a reason to maybe, to use today's terms, cancel it, or is it just simply that Friends is a product of its time and we should understand it in that context?
I think, yes, Friends is a product of its time and we should understand it in its context. I think that doesn't mean it gets a free pass on criticism, however. And at the same time, I would say, no, it doesn't call for cancellation. So, I suppose I'm taking a sort of middle position in terms of those debates. And I can't lie, being a massive fan of the show, you get kind of defensive about it. You don't like to hear sort of problems with it. Whereas I think there are a lot of other occasions I would be all over something for, taking it down for its lack of X, Y, Z, and it's not portraying things realistically. Does it really think this is a version of New York? All of that kind of stuff. But I can't imagine people will be listening and saying, oh, maybe you're giving it a bit of an easy time, because you like the show so much. But I still think those questions about aging, about what it means to become an adult in America, are fundamental. I don't think the show does represent them in a universal way, but the questions are universal, if that makes sense. So I understand why not everyone will love the show and be gushing over it in the same way that I am, for sure.
Yeah, of course. And it's quite funny to look at some of the reactions that Friends gets nowadays, and it is under the microscope more, which is a testament to how big it is versus other shows of the same time. That the political correctness, the sort of those faux pas that would be unacceptable nowadays are scrutinized and they are being picked up on. But as you say, it's not an excuse because it was made in the 90s to forgive that, but
Yeah.
perhaps we should be looking at Friends now more as a snapshot of the time it was made. This isn't just about the show trying to reflect society at the time. It's also about what the makers of that, what it tells us about the
Mhm.
making of the show, and that the kind of the thought processes behind that, because that in itself tells us a lot about where society and culture was at the time, right?
Exactly, and I suppose when the show began, there was no conception of what a massive success it was going to be, and that it was going
Mm,
to go on for 10 years. And I suppose if you had the benefit of hindsight, you might say, well, actually, we will have a much more diverse cast. We can tell lots of different stories because we've got 10 years, to explore all of this. But that didn't happen at the time.
mm,
I do think there are many areas in relation to, race, gender, sexuality, where it really does fall down, and there are a lot of jokes that are not very nice. And for a show that is so smart about its humour, and again, I think that's where it doesn't deserve just being let off the hook, because the show shows that it can do high quality, sophisticated humour that doesn't have to reach for stereotypes, but it does do that sometimes, so I
mm.
think it does deserve being pulled up and more for that. On the other hand, you could say that, for example, there's a gay marriage story. Carol and Susan get married, and that's treated, I think, nicely, in the show, and that was relatively uncommon for the 90s. So there were ways in which it was, I won't say it was ahead of its time, but it broke some new ground equally at the same time as we want to correctly criticise it for its limitations too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's dealing or its inclusion of the lesbian wedding and the storyline, and the ongoing inclusion of Carol and Susan, and that non-nuclear family set up with them and Ross, I think was quite progressive for its time.
Yeah.
And I think, it's also probably worth acknowledging that we look back on Friends and on the way that those sort of characters and situations were dealt with, and think, oh, that was maybe not appropriate. But at the time, it clearly wasn't an
Mhm.
issue because the show
Mhm.
was a success. So
Yeah.
this isn't the show being inappropriate. This is the whole, like, conscience of its audience, that were also in
Yes,
agreement that that was a funny way to deal with something. That
that's
tells
right.
us a lot, doesn't it?
It does, and if we want to criticise the show for certain things, well, we want to criticise the America or the audience, that the show makers and producers thought would find acceptable,
Mm,
this particular content, So I
mm,
think there are questions to be asked of everyone, I suppose, and what the standards of appropriateness were at the time. I think it's interesting also that there's definitely a kind of 90s revival moment in television. I'm watching a few things at the moment, and the 90s does appear to be a historical moment that a lot of programs are reaching to. I'm sure it's for that nostalgia trip again, because a lot of the people probably producing and writing the shows these days are probably in their 30s and 40s and were coming of age themselves in the 90s. So I'm sure that's why the 90s itself is being mined at the moment. So Friends is,
mm,
again, it always seems to be part of its moment, doesn't it? It's now important because people are revisiting the 90s and having this kind of cultural re-examination that we're talking about as well. But sorry, this is a long-winded way of saying that in the 90s, of course, we were pre-Me Too, we were pre-Black Lives Matter. It is kind of shocking to watch the content displayed in the 90s and see the kind of remarks people would make, and there would be no pushback at the time.
mm.
And then I think back to my teenage years and I think, well, yeah, people did say things like that, and people didn't call them out for saying things like that. So it is reflecting the values at the time, unfortunately.
Definitely, yeah. And I can still remember, back in my childhood, and a lot of people that can remember the 90s, there was a societal kind of othering of gay and trans and really anyone in the LGBTQ community. And so the fact that Friends included that at all, I think, was considered a bold step.
Yeah.
How they dealt with it specifically is obviously up for debate, and we can look
Yeah.
back on that now however we want. But just simply including things like that, I think, was progressive for a sitcom.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's a testament to Friends that it's even its mistakes are being used to create the blueprint for shows that followed. And I referenced Big Bang Theory. That, in my opinion, that's a show that would never have existed in the way that we know it if it wasn't for a show like Friends.
Yes, absolutely. And I think like How I Met Your Mother is another very similar one.
Yeah.
There are a number of young people all put together, and they fall out, they get together, then they break up, and everything comes and goes in their lives and things like that. But yeah, what is it that makes those shows different? I do think that's such a good question, and I think there's a warmth in Friends that those other shows don't have. I think even the humor is a bit colder in some ways. I think there is a basic kindness in Friends on the whole, which I think again lends that comfort watch feeling for a lot of viewers. Again, I won't say for all viewers, but I think something like The Big Bang Theory, for me, it has a slightly sharper humor that what didn't always give the comfort in the same way. Again, that's just my opinion, but that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think there's this general sort of shift away from the multi-camera sitcom now. Anyway, The Big Bang Theory is one of the last shows to do that. You even look at its spin-off, Young Sheldon, which I think is a really good sitcom. I really enjoy it, but it's reflective of a sort of a more considered comedy that we get now, which is that single camera. It's treated almost like a drama now.
Yeah.
Very few comedies are created now with the same sort of style and setup of Friends, and I think you do lose something with that. The reason that style of comedy worked is, as we've said before, it's inviting. There's something comforting about it, and it's really bingeable. We know it's
Yeah.
not particularly clever or high end TV, but it's easy viewing.
Yeah, it is. It is, and yet I still think a lot of work goes into making it easy. I still think being able to get some of these plot lines out of really quite banal, small details. Like you get, I don't know what, like 15-minute chunk out of Rachel, Monica, and Phoebe wrestling over a wedding dress in a sales rack or something. Like really small details of people's lives, and it manages to be amplified and find the humor and the pathos and quite small things. I think that's very skilled to be able to do that, and a lot of other shows can't do that in the same way. I actually wondered whether, is it a weird sort of punishing side of Friends' success is that other shows have moved very much away from it, because anything that you do that approximates Friends, you either look derivative, and B, you look like you're not doing it as well as Friends. So in a weird way, Friends has kind of cornered the, as you say, the sort of multi-camera sitcom comedy, in ways that has left less space for others.
It's weird, isn't it? Because as if you were sort of what David Crane and what is it, Marta Kaufman, or the creators, and there's a third one who I've missed. I'm very sorry, but they must be absolutely loving life, because Friends has become like the sort of comparative show for any comedy. If it's too much like Friends, it's criticized for being a copycat. If it's too different from Friends,
Yes.
it's compared for its differences and sort of measured as, is this okay?
Yes.
Does this work? Because Friends worked, so are these changes good?
Mm.
And Friends is still that sort of barometer for comedy, and I think, as you say, easy viewing is a skill. Easy viewing doesn't mean easy to make.
Yes.
And Friends were very aware of what they were making. They were very, very conscious of who they were speaking to, and how they were coming across, and that's why it's lasted so
Yeah.
long.
I think you're right, and yeah, it just started off by kind of it. I think maybe what we forget as well. Well, I don't think you're forgetting it really, but maybe in general, sometimes we forget that Friends was pioneering when it started. And I've been using the word comfort a lot myself when talking about it, but when it started, they were taking quite a lot of risk, with the kind of show that they were doing, and thinking, well, will audiences like that? It was going up in competitive viewing slots alongside programs like Frasier. It was doing something a bit different for a younger audience, and they couldn't guarantee that it would take off as it did. But I'm so glad it did.
Yeah, and actually, we have spoken about the Carol and Susan sort of element here when we look at sort of the representation on screen in Friends, but actually, it's the way that it shows family and like family
Yeah.
dynamics in general. I think for its time, and I know I say that a lot, but for its time, very, very progressive.
Yes.
You've got this co-parenting situation with Ross, Carol, and Susan
Yeah.
when Ben came along in season one. You've got Phoebe, who
Yeah.
her whole story is that her dad ran out on them. Her mum abandoned them. She lived on the street. She doesn't know her sister. This incredibly dysfunctional family dynamic. And you've got Monica, who feels completely unvalued and
Yeah.
unvalidated by her parents, which
That's
maybe
right.
isn't so progressive. But you know there's a lot of dynamics. You've got Chandler, whose dad is a drag queen.
Exactly. Yes.
It's there's a lot going on
There
that
is.
I think now we take it for granted because these issues are so, well, then we don't consider them issues anymore.
I think that's right. I know, and again, that is where it was groundbreaking, I suspect, and people were able to maybe look beyond some of the specifics of the family arrangements that you were watching in Friends and thinking, okay, it's not exactly like Phoebe's story or Chandler's story, but
Mm,
I know a bit about family dysfunction. I know a bit about tension. I know a bit about feeling that, I don't know, my parents think my sibling is great, but not me, or something. So there's a lot of things like I'm not saying I think that, by the way, but that's not a personal story. But I think I think there was a lot in there. And actually, I was thinking just while we were talking, so something like Elizabeth Wurtzel's Prozac Nation is a very famous memoir. It came out in 1993, I think, which is the year just before Friends, and became a real kind of talisman for Generation X. So we've been talking about it more in relation, Friends more in relation to millennial culture, but actually, it would be interesting to hear probably the views of somebody who is about 10 years older than us, who would be closer to the age of the actors in Friends when they were
mm,
doing the show. Because I mean, Matthew Perry was 54, I believe,
mm.
and to hear things like even divorce wasn't as widely talked about or acknowledged, I think,
Yeah.
when Friends came on the scene, So if something like that wasn't even getting the kind of wide traction that we're used to, then we can think about how much further Friends went with the kind of different family scenarios it presents us with.
Yeah, exactly. And Friends, for all the reasons that we might look back on it and say that it was problematic, I think also are the reasons that at the time it was so significant in driving conversations forward and normalizing things that before Friends were very
Yeah.
excluded from the sort of national conversation.
Exactly. And I think that's where the backdrop of sort of coming of age or coming into adulthood is really fascinating to watch in the show, and you get to watch the characters age into themselves and become more comfortable with who they are and make decisions about who they want to be. And I suppose that's ideally what people want to happen for themselves, as well, which again I think is why the show does resonate with so many people.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the people involved with Friends. I think have been involved with Grace and Frankie. I don't know if you've watched any of that. It's looking at two much older women, and that kind of confirms to me that Friends is interested in aging. Definitely
Mm.
it focuses more on youth, but I think it's interested in just people passing through time, how they change, how they stay the same, what their identities are. And again, that's you could say that's a very American preoccupation, but I think it's a very human preoccupation as well.
There are moments when Friends kind of addresses the sort of its aging characters. There's a lot of flashbacks in Friends, and
Yeah,
that was very much of its time. I think
yeah,
we don't really do that anymore in comedy, but there's a lot of flashback episodes, and there's also that episode where Gandalf, their old sort of buddy,
yes,
is back in town, and they suddenly realise that they're just too old to do
that's
this
right.
like all nighter sort of drinking partying
Yes.
sessions anymore.
I
Um,
know, I know. I think my favourite episode in the whole of the Friends over it is the one with the prom video in season 2,
yeah.
where Rachel and Ross get together like properly because she sees him being nice to her on screen when they were both, well, when Rachel's going to a prom and Ross
Mm.
is going to go with her, and then you see the look of devastation in his face when her date actually turns up and they go away. And for me, that is such an archetypal Friends episode because it taps into nostalgia. It
Mm.
gets you thinking about your present self and your future self and your past self. And it uses a screen that's so clever. It's almost like a little meta commentary on itself, that episode, I think, for the whole show of Friends. And it gives you wish fulfillment. It gives you a happy ending. It gives you a sense that these people are meant to be together. They didn't know it at the time, but they will get to sort themselves out in the future. Again, these are very reassuring messages for people. You can make mistakes, but we'll fix it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something very, I think, discreetly aspirational about Friends. It's not like, looking back to other shows I've mentioned already, it's not like trying to win a Nobel Prize like in Big Bang
Mm-hmm.
Theory. It's not like trying to become a renowned radio
Mm-hmm.
star like in Frasier. It's just having a good support network. It's settling down. It's having a career that you're happy with. It's having a
Mm-hmm.
nice home and a nice family around you. You
Exactly.
know, very conventional
Yeah.
aspirations, but nonetheless, I think it's aspirational, and
Exactly.
I think that's why it's so universal, because
Mm-hmm.
to some degree or other, everyone can relate to those kinds of of life goals.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And they're conventional, but they can be very difficult to achieve. You know, it can be difficult to find the person who ends up being your partner. It can be difficult to find out what you want to do with your life. And actually, I suspect young people watching it today will think the Friends characters have it pretty good, you know, because they have pretty stable employment, they have stable residence. I think a lot of that won't speak that realistically to young people today, and yet the show is still watched eagerly by young people today. So that's kind of fascinating as well.
Yeah, and it's sort of thinking about everything that we've discussed. Do you and sort of the impact that Friends has had? Do you think that Friends reflected America, or do you think Friends shaped America? I guess it's that sort of art imitating life, imitating
Yeah,
art kind of cycle, right?
yes, gosh, it's a good question. I think, again, I'm going to give you an answer. It sounds like a cop out and say it probably did both. I think it did reflect a lot of things about American culture. And again, I think that partly explains its success because 1990s America was quite seismic in a lot of ways. You know, there were a lot of big cultural shifts. We talked about coffee, but what that actually represents is the rise of big conglomerations and corporate takeovers and multinational, branches of all sorts of, businesses and things like that, which was actually often a kind of perceived as an American kind of takeover, of consumer culture as well. For some people, that was really exciting. For some people, that was, one of the most evil things about American culture. So the show kind of captures a lot of that as well. And again, you can have your opinion about, the positives about that and the minuses about that, I guess. And then I think the show does shape discussions about friendships, about family, about what people want from life, about what they think adulthood should be, and really good conversations about what Friends leaves out, whose stories aren't told, whose stories should be there. And, when people like me get very excited about the show and say it asks, fundamental universal questions, does it really? There will be people who will push back quite strongly and legitimately on me for saying those kinds of comments, I think.
You mentioned about the time that the sort of the period of time in America and that sort of rise of consumer culture and all of that. Friends actually alluded to that, in the episode where they were trying to cancel the gym membership, and
Yes,
they couldn't. They were constantly
that's true.
being like upsold and like
Yes,
outsmarted by like the corporate machine that was
yeah,
the gym, right? And
that's right.
I think it's a great example of Friends really. It's
Yeah.
not a dumb comedy. It
No,
understands its audience, and it brings these quite big themes and topics,
exactly.
and breaks it down into something really quite relatable and as simple as I want to quit the gym.
Yes, exactly. And they
You
keep
know?
bringing out these very sort of lovely young women to sort of distract Chandler and Ross. And another similar episode is when Phoebe changes her place of employment. So she's still a masseuse, but instead it's for a big company,
Yeah.
and she's got a proper uniform and she's very glamorous and all that. And she keeps talking in different accents in this very futile attempt to sort of make Rachel think that she's not there. And so, yeah, they embrace their own complicity, I suppose,
Mm.
in the kind of consumer culture that they're living in. And but there's also a kind of necessity about it. They need to pay rent, they need to function, in their lives, and sometimes that means making decisions that you're not entirely happy with, but you go with it.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed on rewatching Friends as an adult versus the 11-year-old that first discovered
Mm,
the show is that there's a lot of very adult jokes in there,
yeah.
not just in themes, but like there's a lot of adult jokes, and
Mm,
they really perfect kind of it being lost on children
yes.
enough that anyone of any age can still enjoy the show. But then as an adult, you understand what they're getting at. You understand those little innuendos and those
Yeah.
sort of double entendres, and it just adds another layer of
Mhm.
enjoyment to the show.
It does, and it means again that we get to age along with the show and see things
Mm,
that we didn't see the first time. I do always enjoy that as well. So you can see it as a period piece, but on the other hand, it appears to not date as badly as other shows, precisely as you say, because it sort of layers in those different levels of humor, I suspect. Yeah,
mm. Yeah, and I think we could. Well, I think we could talk about Friends all
I
day
know.
long, but we should probably draw this conversation to some kind of close. And I'm going to do so by asking you a couple of questions. Firstly, an almost impossible one. What is your favourite episode?
I think it is the one with the prom episode I was saying earlier. I just love that
Mm.
episode so much. It's really bittersweet and sets the Ross and Rachel kind of romance off on what is really its more permanent kind of trajectory. It's just lovely. Yeah.
Mm. And so I love that episode. My favourite has to be the probably a classic one, the game where they win the apartment in season
Oh, that's such
four,
a good episode.
which I believe they actually adapted into like a family board game.
Yes, that
Um,
sounds right. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
What does Chandler Bing do? Or what is Chandler Bing's job?
but I do also love the poker episode in season one as well.
Mm,
And
yes.
I think just to give the later series a bit of a shout out, the one where Ross is fine in season 10, I
Yeah.
also think is a classic.
That's really
Um,
good. I know. And I love the one where they all find out where Chandler and Monica have been keeping their relationship a secret, and then Chandler and Phoebe are doing this brinkmanship, about pretending to flirt with each other. I think that's a great ensemble episode as well. And I
yeah,
suppose actually we haven't said, one of the reasons the show did so well, I think, is it had such a strong cast. Like all
mm,
six of the actors were excellent, and they needed to kind of keep that friendship communal focus rather than have it be, I don't know, Jennifer Aniston's show or Matthew Perry's show or something.
yeah, yeah. And I think that was very deliberate, and also I think that was driven a lot by the main cast as well. To really,
Yeah,
you could tell there was a lot of solidarity, and not just in the storylines that they got on screen, but that 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 went backstage as well. They stuck together and made sure they were all paid the same for
exactly. Yeah,
and
I know.
you
And I
know
think actually not to, talk on too sensitive topics, but, Matthew Perry, again, it's pretty well known that he's had a difficult time with, addiction and
mm,
substances and mental health. And I think they rallied round him as well. I think they protected him. They tried to support him. And you didn't see them all talking to the tabloids about, oh, he's such a difficult person to work with. I can't stand it. There was none of that. And I think
yeah.
they all looked after each other in ways that are very moving. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you do see cast members that like main cast members that leave long running shows, and over time there's like animosity between
Yeah.
cast members, but Friends has just never suffered from that. And I think there's been attempts to sort of tabloids mainly and like
Mhm.
gossip magazines always try and say, oh, someone's having a rift with someone else
Yeah.
about this or that, and you always hear these rumors. It's never true.
I
in
know.
in reality they all just seem like such a close group of people.
I think they are. And again, I know you want to wind things up, but I sometimes wonder, is part of that because they had a mixed gender cast?
Mm,
So Sex and the City is one of the ones that gets the fiercest kind of chat about, oh, the women don't like each other, they fall out. It's Sarah Jessica Parker's mad at Kim Cattrall and all that stuff. I think that there's a lot of sexism there, and the fact that it's women all together means you can tap into stereotypes of like bitching and catfighting and things. Friends
mm,
slightly avoided that, I think, by having men and women, being its main group of characters. But I do think
yeah,
there's something specific about that particular group of actors. They worked together for themselves. They didn't allow one person to kind of take supremacy over the others. And actually, that's interesting to think about in relation to American culture, that tension between the individual and the community. So the
yeah.
show plays on all of that, both in terms of its content and in terms of its sort of cast relations. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking about the cast, we don't often give the supporting cast much of a shout out.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite supporting character in Friends?
It's an easy one, but it's Janice. She's just so funny, and that booming foghorn. Oh my god! I think
Yeah.
you just know as soon as she comes on the screen that you're going to be in for a good sort of comedy subplot. Yeah. What about
Oh,
you?
that's a good point actually. Janice is used so sparingly but so effectively, isn't she?
Yeah.
It's great. Mike has to be mine. I think
Uh,
Mike, bringing him in like so late as well. I'm
yeah.
always surprised at how few episodes he was actually in.
Mhm.
But Paul Rudd, I mean, at
Yeah.
the
He's
time you
excellent.
didn't realize what a great comedy actor he was because that
Yeah.
was sort of his kind of one of his breakout roles. But
Yeah.
yeah, he stole every scene he was in my opinion. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love
No,
Mike.
he is fantastic, yeah. And I guess maybe Gunther a little bit, nice to mention him as well. I'm sorry,
Mm,
I can't remember the actor's name. I know he passed away during the pandemic, I think,
mm,
as well. But again, the unrequited love for Rachel, which again was a bit of a subplot. There was a time in the 90s where it felt like all the plots were about somebody being in love with Rachel or something like that. And why not have Gunther as well? That seemed to be very cleverly done, I think.
Yeah, Gunther was that sort of reassuring kind of constant, wasn't he, in the background?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I wonder if he was meant to be a sort of audience proxy or something, the sort of person
Mm,
in the background listening in, and, the friends are friendly to him, but he's not part of that inner circle. I don't know, maybe a sort of complicated version of an audience mirroring there.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, interesting. And finally, just to end this episode, the all important question. It's a two-parter. Firstly, were they on a break? And secondly, whose side are you on?
Oh, yeah. I'm on Rachel's side. That's an easy one to answer. I think they were on a break, but I think what Ross does is very dodgy, so to put it mildly. So I have no sympathy with his behaviour, and I don't think he gets out of it by saying they were on a break.
This episode of America, a history podcast, was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to my guest this week, Rachael McLennan. And if you enjoyed this episode, do check out some of the extra resources that we leave in the show notes. And a lot of work goes into making this show, so if you can leave us a review and a rating, that would really be awesome. Next time, I'm joined by David Silverman as we look at some of the real history behind Turkey Day, as we ask, what is Thanksgiving?